Today is the 15th anniversary of Ben 10, which seemed like a good excuse to post a day earlier than I usually would. And on top of that, I was very nicely invited by the Ink Tank's own Kuro the Artist to participate in a Ben 10 15th anniversary YouTube event with some other awesome Ben 10 focused channels, Xander Flicks and Stan Hanrahan. Now this was obviously super exciting, but also put a little bit of pressure on me because they are all largely Ben 10 focused channels, and they all know the lore better than I do. I of course make my share of Ben 10 content on here, but I haven't seen every series all the way through, and I just don't know it quite as well as they do. So I decided to lean into my strengths. So today I'm gonna take 4 Ben 10 aliens and redesign them and rewrite their stories if they were human superheroes on famous superhero teams. Because I may not know all the Ben 10 lore as well as some of those other guys, but I definitely know my stuff when it comes to teams like the Avengers and the Justice League. So that's today's episode, and we can get right into it after I do my cringy call for likes, because gotta placate that YouTube algorithm with the like button. And of course reminding anyone that's not subscribed that you may want to subscribe if you enjoy the upcoming video, because I do 2 nerdy videos like this every week. And with that finally out of the way, we can jump in, so let's go! Wilbur Mutt had had a difficult upbringing. His parents were distant and put little effort into raising him. At school, he always had a hard time making friends, so he spent much of his early life feeling completely alone. And things would seemingly only get worse when he reached his early teens. Over the course of a week, he sprouted orange fur all over his body, and his vision slowly faded until he was totally blind. He was terrified and in serious need of help, something his distant parents surely wouldn't provide. In fact, to make matters worse, his parents were adamantly anti-mutant, which Wilbur clearly was. They drove him far from home out into a forest and abandoned him there, claiming he was an animal and this is where he deserved to be. You'd think this would be a mortifying experience, but in truth, he was somewhat relieved. Out in the forest, while he was truly isolated, being away from the people who had made him feel alone was actually quite peaceful for him. And in his solitude, he had all the time he needed to further investigate the abilities he'd gained from his mutant transformation. He realized that while his vision had gone, all his other senses were cranked up, and he could easily navigate his way through his wooded home with ease. He also had incredible agility and strength. He started hunting for his food and over the next few months reveled in his isolation. Anytime hunters or hikers would come through, he'd do what he could to scare them off. He wanted nothing to do with the world that had rejected him. But one day he'd pick up a foul scent in the woods, one he didn't recognize as an animal or human. He'd approach to investigate and instinctively tried to terrify this new intruder. He leapt before it and let out a bellowing roar, but the figure would simply reply, "Sorry, bub, I seen a lot scarier than you in my time." The man introduced himself as Logan. He'd come to investigate the town's stories of a monster in the woods, and now, seeing that it was a young mutant boy, he had the perfect place to take him. Of course, Wilbur initially refused. He had no interest in rejoining society, but Logan told him if he didn't come along, the town would likely eventually send someone a lot less friendly to hunt down the boy. Wilbur hesitantly went with Wolverine to the school, all the while wanting to just hide away in his woods. But when he met Charles Xavier and then the other teachers and students, he found they were all incredibly friendly and accepting and genuinely interested and impressed with his gifts. They were all sympathetic to his terrible upbringing, and many of them could relate. Some had even had it worse. This was the first place he'd ever felt truly and completely accepted, and he spent his next years thriving with his fellow classmates. He'd eventually grow so committed to the school that he'd become a teaching assistant and join the ranks of the school's greatest hero team, the X-Men. He'd help them find other kids like he had been, scared and alone, and bring them in to give them the life they deserved. And while the world outside the school's walls wouldn't always be friendly to the mutants, Wilbur knew whenever things were bad, he had a support system of people who loved and understood the once lonely boy. Gregory Upsworth was one of the most ingenious computer and mechanical engineers on the planet. He'd even been called upon in the past to assist the Justice League, so he was not new to the world of heroes when he had his accident. You see, the world had come under attack by Brainiac, who had managed to somehow hypnotize the Justice League into his control. Well, there were other heroes who could fight, they were all being slowly taken over by the mechanical space menace. Upsworth took it upon himself to try and take down Brainiac. He began developing what was supposed to be some sort of EMP plasma, a near-liquid mesh of nanites that could fuse with any machine and disable it. But the development process was pretty slow going. As more and more of the world was falling under Brainiac's control, Upsworth was working harder and harder, to a point where he hadn't slept in 3 days. The more tired he got, the more desperate he became. Eventually, while the plasma was totally untested, he decided to take it out into the field. He hobbled together 5 rockets filled with the plasma, took a makeshift rocket launcher, and headed out towards the heart of Brainiac's operation, a skull-headed ship hovering over Metropolis. He snuck his way through the city's subway system until he got directly under the ship. He fired one of the rockets straight up and it burst against the hull. The plasma only spread against a small section of the ship, but that was enough to start causing problems. The ship's lights flickered and sparked as Upsworth loaded another shot. He took aim at the ship but quickly found a new target, as Brainiac himself shot down from above to see what was going on. Gregory fired straight at him, but Brainiac easily caught the rocket and hurled it back at him. The rocket and all his remaining shots exploded on impact, covering Upsworth in a smoldering mass of nanites. Curious of the technology, Brainiac took the mess back to his ship to investigate the humans' handiwork. This act would be Brainiac's undoing. You see, over the course of the next few hours, the nanites were fusing with Upsworth's body, converting him into a living nanite mesh. Once the fusion was completed, Upsworth awoke with a highly altered body, sitting directly in the center of Brainiac's ship. He quickly found he could alter his mass and could totally alter his shape to take over machines, including the tyrannical invader. Upsworth took over Brainiac's body and shut down every machine he had across the planet, freeing the Justice League and every other hero under his control. He took Brainiac to the Justice League and told them what had occurred. From there, he was even able to help them create a prison to contain Brainiac. With the combination of his genius intellect and his newfound abilities, Upsworth was graciously invited into the Justice League. He would become a major asset to the team and would help ensure that no mechanical maniacs would ever be able to hold any major threat over the Earth ever again. Chuck was a somewhat late addition to the Umbrella Academy. When his mother spontaneously became pregnant and gave birth to this superhuman baby, like had happened to 42 other women around the world that fateful day, she was of course terrified and confused, but she was willing to try raising the boy. Sir Reginald Hargreaves had come to her to try and buy the boy away, but she'd initially refused. Though after 5 years of trying to raise the boy, she'd realized she couldn't do it. Chuck had to eat 10 times what an average child did, and if she didn't feed him enough, he'd fire 3 long green tongues from his mouth, grab random items around the house, and eat those to sate his hunger. He'd also at random burp up green balls of slime that would explode on impact. Plus, the more he ate, the greener and glossier his skin would become. All this combined was too much for a young single mother, and she then found Reginald Hargreaves again and asked if the offer still stood. He was no longer willing to pay for the boy, but agreed to take him off her hands on the condition that she not try to contact them again. It was a horrifying decision to have to make, but she knew she couldn't raise Chuck herself, so she agreed. Reginald had already numbered the other children in his care by the strength of their powers, so he grudgingly referred to the boy as 3.5, as he deemed his powers were lesser than Allison's, but more useful than Klaus's. Chuck grew up with the same troubled life as the rest of his new siblings. Reginald was a cruel parent that worked them hard to be his private team of superheroes. Reginald would force the boy to train by eating more and more, and see how many explosive blasts he could build up at once. This would often lead to him feeling very sick. Eventually, in his young adult years, like many of his siblings, Chuck would abandon the team. He went to find his birth mother, who was thrilled to see him and hugely apologetic for having given him up. But he understood her reasoning. He moved into a place in her town, and she introduced him to all his neighbors. He eventually managed to live a relatively normal life. That is, until he got the fateful call that his unloving so-called father, Reginald Hargreaves, was dead. This, as many of us know, would spur a series of events that would force Chuck back into the heroing life, fighting alongside the siblings who he'd shared his trying upbringing with. After the events of the blip, when the Avengers brought everyone who'd been snapped away by Thanos back, the world tried to return to normal, but obviously a lot of things had changed. Some more than others. Xena was a university student in school on a cross-country running scholarship, and she'd been one of many snapped away. When she returned, something had seriously changed within her. The snap had altered her physiology, and when she returned, she could run at superhuman speeds. While this was exciting and all, it meant she could no longer compete in her sport, as anyone with superhuman abilities was automatically banned for having an obviously unfair advantage. She lost her scholarship and had to leave school. She got a job as a waitress to temporarily make ends meet, but in her spare time was taking a play out of Spider-Man's book and was doing some hero work. She'd seen that he had worked his way up in the hero world until he was made an Avenger, and she wanted to do the same. She built herself a makeshift costume and soon found she could increase her speeds by wearing rollerblades when she worked. Eventually, she went to New York to try her luck at some hero work there, and eventually even got to team up with Spidey. He'd be impressed with her drive and her abilities, and he'd take her to meet some of the Avengers, who were obviously, at the time, in a bit of a broken state thanks to the loss of some of their founding members. They weren't in a place to fully reband for any superhero work, but after seeing her in action protecting people, they'd soon officially invite her into the ranks of the team, and she'd be on call for any major disasters that may rise in the future. Spidey would let her use some tech Tony had left for him to develop her own proper Avengers-branded supersuit. One that was perfectly aerodynamic, could regulate her temperature at high speeds, and could withstand the friction of her superhuman movements. After a few years of work, she'd eventually be well regarded as one of the Earth's mightiest heroes. I think this might take the place of my favorite Ben 10 video I've made on this channel. I mean, it's a tough call because I really liked how the Ben 10 Dragons episode turned out, but I don't know, I'm pretty happy with this one, both the stories and the artwork. But anyway, if you're watching this as the video premiered, in a couple minutes I'm gonna be on a live stream over on the Ink Tank's channel, so you can jump over to that with me now. Or if you're watching this in the future, please make sure to check out videos from all the other awesome people involved with the event today. The Ink Tank, Xander Flicks, and Stan Hanrahan are all channels that put out awesome stuff today, and I'll link their channels and videos in the description below, and probably in the pinned comment and whatever else. And of course, if you're new here, you can check out a whole bunch of my other Ben 10 videos. I've venomized Ben 10 characters, turned them into dragons, made them human supervillains, fused them with My Hero Academia characters, got tons of Ben 10 videos on here. But anyway, everybody, that's all for today. I'm Christian Pearson. This has been PopCross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks again to Kuro the artist for inviting me to participate today. And I'll see you all in the next video on Friday, back on the usual schedule of Mondays and Fridays, for this month's Community Redraw episode. Alright, everybody, goodbye.